Good morning, everyone. We're so happy that you were able to join us this morning. Again, NJPSA FEA is proud to present these webinars in our effort to support your work in your schools. I start every webinar with thanking all of our educators for everything that they are doing right now in this turbulent time. Of course, first COVID-19, but now the horrific death of George Floyd and how that has laid bare the level of racism and social injustice in our country. We certainly recognize the pain that our African American colleagues, all African Americans, are feeling at this particular time. We recognize it. Many of us cannot experience the depth of that pain, but I can tell you that NJPSA and FEA have made a statement that we will support our colleagues by action. And I think that's very important during this time, as action is what is needed. We can't have this happening in our country over and over and over again. And so the time for action is now. And this webinar basically is our first action in having a dialogue about this topic and beginning to provide support to educators across the state to take action in their own communities and in their school communities. So with that, I would really like to thank our illustrious panel. Really, they have been amazing in helping to develop what we're about to hear about today and experience today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Nash, our Director of Legal One.
Thanks so much, Pat, and thank you everyone for taking time out of, we know, what are incredibly busy schedules to be with us to discuss these critical issues. We're so fortunate to have such a tremendous group with us for today's presentation. We knew that it was critical that we do what we can to help you in the field as we are thinking through our role in addressing issues of racial injustice, our role in promoting equity and promoting support for all of our students. And we want to give you a blueprint to help you move forward on these issues. So we have a wonderful group that you're going to be hearing from over the next hour and a half. We have with us George Guy. George is the principal of Rosa International Middle School in Cherry Hill. Thank you so much, George, for being with us today. We also have with us Robin Harden-Daniels. Robin is an educational consultant who has done a tremendous amount of work with us on issues of racial equity and social justice, and so much of the professional development work that we are doing to support school leaders across the state, and very fortunate to have Robin with us as well. We also have with us George Scott. George is one of the leaders in the state when it comes to addressing issues of mental health and supporting the emotional well-being of all of our students and staff members. And George also is a key player in the traumatic loss coalitions for youth that are run through Rutgers University Behavioral Health Care. And as always, we have Rebecca Gold with us. Rebecca is currently an interim director of human resources and has done incredible work in helping us to put together so many of our webinars and our in-person training on issues of affirmative action. As we work through today's presentation, we're thrilled that we have such a large number of participants who've signed up for our program, nearly 1,500. We are going to encourage questions at various points in time throughout today's presentation. So we do encourage you to type in questions. Obviously, with so many participants, we're not likely to be able to address all of your questions, but rest assured we will capture them. We will review all of them, and they will inform all of our work moving forward. And we also want to let you know that we are recording today's webinar, and all of you will receive a follow-up 24 hours from now with a link to the recording and the PowerPoint, which, by the way, is also available right now for you to download in the resource materials for today's webinar. But you will also receive a follow-up email with that information. So again, we are dealing with a critical moment in history at this point in time. We are dealing with both a global pandemic that we are struggling with and the profound impact that that global pandemic has had on our society, students, staff, parents, and community. We're dealing with the profound impact of systemic racism that has been laid bare through horrific incidents that we have all seen, including the killing of George Floyd. And we're struggling with what our role can be in addressing these difficult issues as school leaders, as educators, as key stakeholders in our communities. So today we're going to try to give you some best practices and some resources to help you be an important part of this discussion. We want to help you in a meaningful way to move forward in thinking through your role and the role of everyone in our schools. We also want to give you a blueprint for action to help you understand how can we take the meaningful next steps to have a more just society, to, in a meaningful way, address issues of racial injustice and social injustice. So we're going to give you great resources, great steps. We have a wonderful panel of presenters to help us with all of these issues. So let me turn over at this moment to George Guy to get us started.
All right, thank you so much, Dave, and welcome to all of our participants. David, if you could just go through all four, there we go. So over the last 15 or so days, not only here in the United States, but all around the world, there have been overwhelmingly peaceful protests that we cannot ignore as it relates to police brutality within the African American or the Black community, but other social injustices as well. So this is something that our pre-K to 12 schools needs to begin to address. Next slide, please, David. So we put this slide in because within these incredible protests, we are seeing student voice and the value of student voice. And I thought that this particular picture was telling. I'll read it for you. It says, "We said Black Lives Matter. We never said only Black Lives Matter. We know all lives matter. We just need your help with Black Lives Matter, for Black lives are in danger." And I think that particular piece says a great deal about the mandate for all of us moving forward as it relates to racial injustice and how we can move expeditiously to support reforms and revolution in our pre-K to 12 schools. Next slide, please.
So here we have a quote, inspirational, thought-provoking quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. "Racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. Then you see it's everywhere. As long as we keep shining that light, we have a chance of cleaning it wherever it lands. But we have to stay vigilant because it's still always in the air." And so we have a questionnaire here. We have a next slide for it.
Oops.
Okay.
So Rob, this is a point where we would do our first poll.
Yes. So if you could respond to it. This quote uses dust as a metaphor in describing racism in American society. And then you have your options that you see here in response. Okay, we should be good by now.
Great. Any comments on the results, Robin?
I can't see the results yet.
Rob, are you able to pull that up?
Yes. The first option where racism is pervasive was 98% of the audience.
Yeah.
Okay.
It
And
tells us
1% for exaggerates the problem.
Yeah. So obviously, I think there is a universal consensus at this point that we do have a major issue in our society that it is time for all of us to grapple with. George, Guy, thoughts on the disproportionate impact that we are seeing on racial and ethnic minorities from the global pandemic?
We think that the evidence from COVID-19, specifically with us dealing with this for the past 3 months as a nation and globally, has had a disproportionate effect on ethnic minorities. And we think that that is important because over the past 16 days of protests and unrest and sparked by Floyd's death, George Floyd's death, and also Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, was coming on the tail end of African-American communities specifically dealing with COVID-19 and the impacts of that. And we just gave you some bullets about that many, and these we don't want to stereotype, but many ethnic minorities tend to live in dense urban environments in which it makes it very difficult to segregate oneself if you have other members that have tested positive for COVID-19. There are a lot of multi-generational African-American folks that are living in one domicile, multifamily domiciles. So the protection of elderly folks, anyone over the age of 60 makes it problematic. Ethnic minorities also are experiencing higher levels of underlying health conditions. I'm thinking about respiratory conditions like asthma that could affect COVID-19. I'm thinking about diabetes and ancillary pieces that deal with that health condition. Also, ethnic minorities tend to struggle with healthcare and having appropriate healthcare. A number of ethnic minorities, especially within the African-American community, were essential workers of low-paying jobs and did not have the opportunity to experience paid sick leave. So all of that was on the heels of, or right at the edge of the last 16 days in which we've dealt with policing and racial injustice within policing. I would also add, and we didn't put this bullet in, but it certainly bears to measure that disproportionately Black and Brown communities here in the state of New Jersey and around the country have been affected by COVID positive tests and COVID-19 related deaths. I know I've experienced it in my family. A number of ethnic minority families have experienced that. And then finally, there are at least 1.2 million folks around the nation, and 94,000 of them are in the state of New Jersey that have put in for unemployment. We found a poll from NJ.com yesterday that said about 96% of them have been responded to and at least are getting benefits, but many of them had to wait 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks for those benefits. So all of those economic and health disparities compounded with where we see the racial injustice for the George Floyd murder are things that pre-K to 12 institutions need to take into consideration as we move forward with interventions. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. So we did, this is the survey that obviously folks did respond to, and we saw the overwhelming response about racism and how clearly there is this growing national consensus that we do have to grapple with this issue. And as we said, we are dealing with massive and overlapping challenges. These challenges have a profound impact when we sort of see them playing out right in front of us here and across the world, and a profound impact on us as adults and on our children, especially when we're thinking about issues of racial injustice and police brutality. the disproportionate impact that George just spoke about on poor and minority communities. But in many ways, we have seen an inspiring response over these last several weeks. The worldwide protests, the incredibly diverse worldwide protests that have been overwhelmingly peaceful. And it does feel like we're at an inflection point in our history where we can make a difference, where we can move forward more than incrementally, where we can make a major shift in our society in a positive direction. So let me turn to George Scott to talk about some of the emotions that we're all trying to process.
There we go. Good morning, everyone. David, is the sound okay?
Yes.
Great. Good morning, everyone. And before I begin with these comments, I just want to, on my personal behalf, welcome members of the Traumatic Loss Coalition who signed up to be a part of this, as well as members of something called Open Forum. And the reason I say welcome to all of you is because my experience with you is you are torchbearers on this information. This will help you get grounded even more in a way that touches your heart and touches your belief. And I'm just really so proud that you're a part of this. So as we were putting together our thoughts around the webinar, one of the things that occurred to me, and we've talked it through, is that from a distance, we frequently look at the protests as a bunch of angry people. And out of that, there seems to be a sense of anger is not a good thing. And what I want to highlight is anger is actually a really good thing. I mean, anger is a normal reaction. It's a human reaction. In fact, it's a normal reaction frequently to abnormal situations. And I say this in a sense of it scares us sometimes. I'll talk to the educators when one of our youngsters is angry. You know, disrespect is also not a mental health issue. Disrespect is a feeling of not being heard and not being listened to. So from a mental health point of view, I want to be sure that folks don't begin to categorize our staff colleagues and our children or family members as having an extreme reaction or a mental health reaction or a diagnosable reaction, because the reality is it is a normal reaction. And when we understand it, then we can stay in the discomfort of the conversation. David, next slide, please. David, you know, let me back up. Robin, could you talk about, you added a really nice nuance there, righteous indignation. Could you share a little bit about that?
Yes, you know, when we're preparing for this, the phrase righteous indignation occurred to me. And what happens is a lot of times we have what we call cultural discontinuity. And cultural discontinuity is when the pieces just don't match up, where one person's framework is very different from another person's framework. And when those two parties come together, that's when you feel the disconnection. And so what happens is when we're looking at Euro-American cultures, and that's what school cultures are, they're based on white middle-class Protestant norms. And you have, which comes out of an individualistic kind of orientation. A lot of places where you have brown, those people and those cultures tend to be more communalistic. So when I say brown people in terms of skin, brown eyes, brown hair. So you look at Asian, you look at Latino, you look at African cultures, they're on the spectrum of being communal. And their communal perspectives may vary, but they're still in that mindset of the group is more important than the individual. So when you have a situation like this, where it's very much emotionally charged for understandable reasons, those of us in school cultures that are abiding and working within that paradigm, we've been trained to kind of subdue emotion. You know, like when you're angry, you're supposed to stay in control. Your voice is supposed to stay low. You know, you purse your lips. You don't quite move your mouth. You stay calm and poised and controlled. And we tend to see emotion as something that is negative, and we tend to be put off by strong expressions of emotion. And so when we're interacting with students who have come through a traumatic situation, and who look at situations like what happened in Minnesota with George Floyd, you know, they're seeing someone that looks like them being mistreated, abused to the extreme by someone who doesn't look like them. And so, yes, there's going to be understandably a sense of righteous indignation, a profound sense of anger, coupled with the sense of this is incredibly morally wrong. And so that idea of anger, which can be explosive and may not necessarily be grounded, versus righteous indignation, it says, yes, that anger is grounded in a truth that all of us need to look at and validate and respond to in responsible ways. So I just want to say one more thing when we're along the cultural anthropology vein. Back in the 1940s, there was a researcher by the name of David Aberle, and he and his team postulated that there are 9 functional prerequisites that societies have to have in order to grow and thrive. And one of those functional prerequisites is called a shared cognitive orientation. To some degree, there has to be an overlap in how we see the world. And so the brief little survey we started off with is kind of like a touch point to see, are we sufficiently overlapping in how we see and interpret this situation? And so the numbers say we're pretty much on the same page in terms of understanding that this is something that just doesn't affect that individual Floyd family, or not even that community in Minnesota. People are rightfully seeing that this has a global impact, that this kind of injustice shouldn't be experienced by anyone, anywhere. And so that's, again, to that understanding of righteous indignation that can be used as a catalytic event, as a catalyst for producing long-term changes.
That's great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Robin. A really profound way of expanding our understanding. And, you know, for the educators who are out there, I think one of the things we all agree to right now is we're not quite sure what it's going to look like when we get back to school. But one of the things that we can be assured of is our children will bring with them all of these experiences and these feelings and the emotions, and we should no longer be in a position to suppress them, but we should be asking for storytelling about them. Because when people are heard, people cooperate, and when they cooperate, that's communal, and we look at that structure as the classroom. So we have built inside of our history here in education opportunities to just be different with each other. So anger does originate in the experience, right? And when we want to talk about our African-American youth or our kids of color, our people of color, there are things that either they personally have experienced or because of the community has experienced. And we know now that there's intergenerational trauma. We know now that there's a legacy that gets passed down inside of families. And it's true of families of color, but it's also true of white families. There is a legacy. And the issue then is when we have had those experiences in the past, we do have a tendency to act on them in the present. And if we understood them, then the environment can be shifted in order to honor them. And that's the issue of the experiences. David? This just jumped out at me. You know, we're talking about, I'm a special ed guy in my history. You know, that's where I spent a great part of my career, as some of you know. And, you know, there are segregating factors that exist in our communities. And sometimes we don't see them as such. But when I saw that in urban areas, in some detention centers, over 50% of those young people had IEPs. Now I begin to take a look at, is the IEP, with all good intention, but is the IEP a tool for segregation? Have we used it too easily, too comfortably? And what I do believe is this, from years of talking with good-hearted, well-intended teachers and administrators and parents, what I believe is that if we're not sure what to do, we're going to take that in order to get it off our plate and get it resolved. And many times that has been special education. So now we have 2 factors, special education and incarceration. And George probably will talk about the pipeline later. So what we know is that eyes open, different, we have to rethink how we approach these challenging behaviors, these challenging learning issues that our kids present, and create other alternatives. So for several years now, and this goes to David Nash and as well, he and I and many others have been taking a look at how does the ACEs research, the adverse childhood experience research, affect not only kids and learners, because it does, but it also affects staff, because it does. Let me give you a brief synopsis of this. What you see on this chart represents these 10 original inquiries out of the ACEs research. And what they were looking at, they were looking for whether or not there are experiences between birth and 18 that in fact change the trajectory of a human being's life, both emotionally and also physically. And what they discovered is absolutely it does. And here they are. So the first, on that first side, the first column, as educators, we know we're aware of abuse, right? We're mandated reporters. We have to pay attention to that. And what we're talking about there is both the physical and the emotional and the sexual abuse as a profound negative impact effect on our children. In addition to that, there's neglect. There's both the emotional neglect and the physical neglect. Now, those first 5 are things that happen directly to the child. And here's the thing that we have to tell our kids, it's not their fault. There's nothing wrong with them. The question that we ask when we see behavior that we don't understand is what happened? How did you get from there to here? And when we shift that thinking about our children, when we shift that thinking about each other, it gives us pause. It creates appropriate space for us to have a dialogue about it. And then there's the second part of that. There is you can see what the other 5 there are, including mental health in the family, the concept of bearing witness to traumatic events, and in the home, bearing witness to the maternal figure, either being physically or emotionally abused. There's divorce, profound effect on kids, whole other conversation. There's incarceration, and there's the use of street drugs or other kinds of script drugs, where the hurt that one feels needs to be controlled by some other kinds of means. The higher your ACEs score, you would get 1 for each of those areas. The higher your ACEs score, or the higher a child's ACEs score, we can expect that likely there's going to be some difficulty as learners. There's going to be difficulty in relationships. And what I always share with teachers that I love the work that you do. However, being human doesn't mean, and being a teacher doesn't mean you escaped your own ACEs. And when it's prolonged and when we hold it, we have a tendency to be more irritable, more reactive, more judgmental. That's not make you a bad person. That's how the neurobiology works. David? So instead of that stigmatizing mental health issues, and what's really interesting, it's began with the COVID, right? Now we're beginning to see on TV even some public service announcements about recognizing the negative effect on stress and isolation, and holding up the fact that those things called mental health issues deserve our attention and deserve our respect, just like physical things. And what I'm hoping is that this seismic shift in our belief in the culture will continue, because if it does, we will have a different conversation with our children, between each other, around these issues of mental health and mental wellness. We have to normalize behavior as a sign and signal that something in here is not going well. I've had an opportunity to hear Dr. Breland Noble. She's got a noble project going on in Washington, D.C. It's called the Acoma Project. And what it's focused on is kids of color and what is their relationship to mental health services. Is it really that they don't appreciate or they don't have access to, or are there other dynamics going on? And from that work, and this is a resource slide for you folks, it's how can we learn more? And there will be a spillover too into kids, other kids, white kids, in what is our kids' relationship to seeking help and receiving help around things that they don't understand. David? And I want to highlight on this that there's another factor going on. It's well known by some, and that is within the African American community, particularly frequently for adults and for their children, the first go-to for help is the faith community, because that is community. That's where they feel respected and honored. So therefore, partnering, and we do this with Traumatic Loss Coalition around coming together following the death of a child, and that is, how do pastors and rabbis and imams, how do they serve together to promote healing? So the faith-based mental health is really significant. We don't want kids to continue to suffer in silence. And when they have to be silent, the suffering is greater. When there is not an avenue to try to talk about it, when there's not an avenue to feel safe crying with somebody about it, it makes it worse. So when that is opened up, when we make ourselves more vulnerable, there's more healing.
George, you want to talk a little bit about the impact of prolonged exposure to racial injustice and how in many ways, you know, it becomes inescapable, what we're seeing on an ongoing basis?
Now, which George are you referencing?
George Scott, yeah.
Sure. Prolonged everything is not good for us. We can recover after moments of stress, after moments of trial, but when it's prolonged, we internalize it, it becomes part of who we are. And when we lose hopefulness, when we can't see the light at all, we can't even feel the warmth of the light at all, it has this internal effect that unfortunately for some, unless there is an intentional effort to connect, that will become harmful to them and those around them. And it has to be on our part. It has to be intentional. This was a piece of research. It's recent. It just came out this month in EdNext, and it's referenced there so folks can follow up on it. But there's a difference, and it's done within the African American community. So it's done with Black and Brown youth. But in that cohort, in that group, there's a difference between bearing witness to a shootout in the community, where there are two sides shooting at each other. There is a difference from that to gang violence, where there is shooting toward each other or anger and hurt toward each other. There's a difference between both of those and unarmed, innocent human beings, Black males and females, being killed. That last example has a profound effect. And if we just want to look at it as educators, we'll do the next slides and see what that looks like. You can see that their performance and that their incidence of emotional upheaval accelerates, because it doesn't make sense to them. But it doesn't make sense to any of us. That's not this internal sense of connectedness and soulfulness that we have with each other. So therefore, they can't make it make sense. They can't even remedy it themselves. So therefore, what we're saying and what you're seeing is our youth, even if it's not in their community, but the TV or the internet brings it into their community, you can see the profound effect that they will have. We should be expected as educators to understand that when our children come back to school. Now, I think this statement, I'm just going to defend the other folks. I don't think that Asian and white kids are unaffected. I don't believe they're all unaffected. But when you see the power of the effect, much more among our Black and Hispanic kids. This stands on its own merit. You don't need George Scott to talk about it.
Yeah. And you did talk through this issue, the huge difference, all in looking at incidents where someone is completely unarmed.
And in the midst of this, and it may come up later, but in the midst of this is the equally important just not as big, but equally important conversation about police in the schools.
Absolutely.
So for my part, I wanted to end with this, and this came to me probably almost a year ago. David, go to the next slide. It's a true story. It's about this gentleman here, Mr. Chabanda, who is a psychiatrist in Harare, Zimbabwe. And please check out his TED Talk. He got a call from a doctor in an ER 100 miles away. That doctor was treating this young woman, Erica, who was 26-year-old and who attempted suicide. The doctor in the ER was trying to connect a post-release follow-up, a place where Erica could go for help. So they made the arrangement that there would be, in fact, an appointment with Dr. Chabanda. Now, he is one of 12 psychiatrists among 16 million people in Zimbabwe. Do the math, see the access. So she was 100 miles away. And when he followed up, because he never heard from her, the mom said to him, "I'm really sorry, doctor, we didn't have the $15 bus fare to come to you in Harare." David, Erica died. That was more than this doctor could manage. He felt responsible. And here became this tipping point where he decided there's got to be another way. So what they began to do is create teams, and they would pull grandmoms from the villages into the mental health work. They would teach them some basic evidence-based talk therapy. They would, in fact, each of the villages would know that this grandma was available to listen, to guide, to help. And what happened was, next slide, David, please. The Friendship Bench program was created, that there is a bench that has its own identity in the community. And that people know that when grandma is there, they can come unannounced for free and sit and connect and attach to somebody who's empathetic and understanding and gentle. And now it's been empirically vetted, right? So we know that it has value. You don't have to have a lot of initials after your name to be a therapist, a healer. And we're expanding it even in the country. The idea is you don't have to do that, but is there something that you can do that's that simple, that's low impact in terms of money and high impact in terms of people? That's part of the challenge.
So I wonder, George, Scott, and all of our panelists, how can we learn from the Friendship Bench? I think there is this notion sometimes that unless you are a trained mental health professional, you are not equipped to help with some of these issues. And there is this fear of saying we're doing the wrong thing. It seems to me that the Friendship Bench is a good example of how we can equip lots of folks to help with these issues without going beyond their expertise.
You know, if I can comment on that, David, I want to comment, and I'm going to go back to something Robin said earlier. You know, one of the things that we forget, don't pay attention to, overlook, is that within community, there's wisdom. How do we tap wisdom? That we know is that for many, the more years of experience you have doing this life, there's wisdom. And we seem to have in our culture ignored that. The Asian culture honors it. We seem to ignore it. So there are, I think, ways there can be wisdom within a school community. There can be wisdom within a classroom community. So what we have to harness and we have to let go of is the fact that our ability to help and heal is only limited to those few people that have gone to college and have these big advanced degrees, because that's not true. I mean, good for them. I mean, I'm glad we have people with advanced knowledge and training to help, but that doesn't mean the rest of us don't have a role in doing this. It's simple conversations, it's kitchen table conversations, it's stoop conversations, it's street corner conversations, and they can be helpful or they can be hurtful. So I do believe there are some lessons here.
So we have embedded a link to the friendship bench for those who want to do a deeper dive into that particular model. And there are so many other examples of this where we have empowered all of our staff to help play a role in these issues. And of course, it's wonderful having the advanced mental health professionals that we do, but I think that's such an important point, George.
And what I like here is it's not mental health, it's mental healthiness.
Yeah.
Healthiness is important. Physical healthiness is important. Emotional healthiness is important. And for those schools that embrace SEL, they're on their way. For those schools that embrace ACEs, they're on their way. For those schools who haven't gotten there yet, it's just a steeper climb, but you can be on your way.
We talked about this, but just reinforcing the point one more time, that just having a greater understanding of where someone has been, what they have been through, makes a huge difference in how we respond. Very rarely when kids are doing something that maybe isn't the ideal behavior that we hoped for, very rarely is it personal, where it's about you as an educator or you as a school administrator, but sometimes we take it personally. And I think understanding where kids are coming from and where we are coming from and our own experiences goes a long way at changing the way we react, the way we respond when we see various types of behavior. So this is just another quick reminder of the various ACEs, and to the extent we have a greater self-awareness, it changes all of us.
So the counterpart of this is this issue of resiliency, of being able to respond, this heal, bounce back. And there's an interesting quote. I love this book. It's another resource for your for the folks that are watching. It's Childhood Disrupted by Donna Jackson Nakasawa. And what she talks about is resiliency in spite of ACEs. Resiliency is more likely if in that child's life, one significant, important, reliable adult was there, that there was someone to lean on, that you went through your tough times with someone who assured you you weren't alone and assured you it would be okay because you're going to do it together. That develops resiliency. And there are lots of things that chip away at it. So therefore, resiliency is the seeds of it are always there. And what we talk to teachers about is the way that you create environment in your classroom, the way that leadership disciplines children. They get message about I can or I can't, I'm worthy or I'm not, and we can build resiliency out of that. So let's not forget that resiliency is an incredibly important part of survival.
Absolutely. So as we're thinking through what our role can be on all of these issues, we want to help you navigate a difficult legal maze. We want to support our children. We want to move this conversation forward. We want to help make fundamental change to the extent that we can contribute to it in our society. And we have to understand certain, sometimes challenging legal principles in order to maximize our ability to do that. So it's important to understand student and staff member First Amendment rights. We all have First Amendment rights. We all have the ability to express our views on issues. We have to think about the rights a little bit differently when it comes to students and their rights versus staff members and their rights. So students have a right to make us uncomfortable. They have a right to say things that we might not want them to say within certain limits. So obviously the sort of benchmark case when we think about student First Amendment rights is Tinker versus Des Moines, and the idea that students have a right to express their views on fundamental policy issues, political issues, as long as they're not doing it in a way that is disrupting our school environment or endangering others. So it's critical that we allow students to have a voice now, and that we not only allow it, but we help encourage it and promote that voice in responsible ways. Staff members also have a voice. I mean, you are citizens, you have a right to express yourself. However, we do have to be mindful that staff members should not be voicing their political views during the day in the school environment. But I want to distinguish between your personal political views and universally accepted principles. You should be voicing support for racial equity and justice. That's not a personal political view. That is a universal principle that we have accepted as a state and as a country. And we should not shy away from discussing those, what should be universal values that we need to have as a society. So we need to be aware of the fact that everything that we are saying and doing as adults, we are role models for our kids. We want to help kids think through how can they responsibly engage. Civic engagement is a huge part of our educational system, and we have an incredible opportunity here to help kids. We experienced some of this when our nation was struggling with the aftermath of the Parkland shooting. And we had incredible kids here in New Jersey and across the country who felt this urgent need to speak out, to express their views. And we helped them do that. We help them find appropriate, safe ways to express their views on life and death matters. And our kids were incredibly responsible and rose to that occasion. So it's important for us to learn from that lesson, find venues, find ways to support kids, give them a safe space to express their views on these issues, and to keep going back to those universal principles that we all need to accept. And embrace and learn from and support. We do have to recognize, as we're trying to help kids and trying to help each other deal with this moment in history and try to turn it into an opportunity for lasting change, we do have to be aware of the wonderful potential that we have in social media and the significant dangers of how others might perceive what we're saying and doing. So we have to be aware of our own social media presence. If we are kind of moving beyond those universal principles that we've all, that we need to embrace as a school leader, as a society, if we're moving beyond that and starting to express more specific political views on specific political candidates or things along that lines, we need to make sure we're doing that on our own time outside of school. And understanding that distinction is very important. We have a legal obligation to address inequities and to sometimes look in the mirror and to honestly acknowledge our own data. So there is clear evidence in looking at the data when it comes to student discipline in New Jersey and across the nation that there are huge disparities in discipline that are linked to issues of race. African American students are more than twice as likely as other students to be suspended. We need to look at our code of student conduct and not simply say, well, the rules are the same for everyone. We have to look at the impact of our code of student conduct. And sometimes, and in many cases, we see a disparate impact on people of color. And when we're seeing that, we have to ask why. And part of the reason that we're seeing in some of the research when we ask why is that where we have more subjective areas where we are interpreting student behavior, a student is being disrespectful. We interpret that behavior differently, sometimes based on the color of the student. And that's an uncomfortable conversation to have, but it's time for us to have those conversations. And in most cases, we're not talking about explicit biases. We're generally talking about implicit biases, but nevertheless biases that need to be addressed. So thinking more about restorative justice and embracing that. We've sort of had to do that now while we're going through this pandemic because it doesn't mean much to a student if you say you're suspended for a day when you're on home instruction already and everybody's on home instruction. So we need to look at ways to embrace restorative justice for all students. While doing that, protecting everyone's due process rights and going out of our way to make sure that students and their parents and families understand their due process rights. And we have to work very hard at looking at the memorandum of agreement between education and law enforcement to make sure that it is promoting a constructive dialogue for all students, constructive collaboration, that it's not inadvertently creating a sense of fear and anxiety among some of our students. And that takes work. We have very strong anti-discrimination laws in the state of New Jersey, some of the strongest in the country. And we need to work hard to make sure that they're not just on paper. Our affirmative action officers have a huge role to play in that process. We have to be aware of HIV incidents that could occur. And that's where we do have some limitations on student First Amendment rights. Students have a right to express their views on a wide range of issues. They don't have a right to demean others because of their race, ethnicity, gender, disability, sexual orientation, religion, or for a whole myriad of other reasons. So when students start to do things that are actively causing harm to others, we generally have to respond. We have HIV incidents that we need to address, and it could be much more than that. We also have a legal obligation beyond just the fact that it's a moral and ethical obligation, but a legal obligation to address the well-being and the mental health needs of all of our students and our staff. When we see staff members who are struggling with issues or students, we need to proactively engage with them and support them and have those dialogues. We need to make sure that we're using de-escalation and prevention strategies in place of student restraint. African American students are far more likely to be physically restrained than other students. And we see that in data in New Jersey and across the country. It's part of the reason why New Jersey has put in place a very strong law for students with disabilities and putting severe limits on the ability to restrain those students. We have seen children who've died because of inappropriate restraint. And we have to make sure that we're embracing those de-escalation and prevention strategies so that we don't have to get to that point. We have a legal obligation to promote diversity in all levels of staffing. Every district has an obligation to look at what they are doing to promote a greater pool of candidates who are more diverse, who look more like our kids, who allow for a more universal experience for everyone. And we have a legal obligation to engage in those difficult conversations about race. When you look at our curriculum, when you look at the things that we have said we are required to do in the state of New Jersey, it's there. We should be having those difficult conversations and equipping our staff members to have those conversations. And we have to think about the proper role of the school resource officer. Not all school districts have school resource officers, but most do, at least at the high school level. So we have to ask ourselves, who is the SRO there to protect? Have we misused the SRO? Are we asking SROs to do things that others in our schools should be doing? Have we emphasized de-escalation? We can all think of some of the horrific videos we've seen from scenes across the country where you had SROs who didn't react appropriately, who ended up physically assaulting or dragging students or escalating situations that could have been de-escalated. So we need to take the time to make sure that the SROs, where they are in our schools, understand their role. So oftentimes we are too fast to ask the SRO to intercede. In many cases, others should be stepping in, and the SRO should be sort of the last resort. There's an interesting report, George, Guy, maybe you want to talk about this for a moment, from Texas, on the role of the SRO.
Thank you, David. So I think that the report that is presented just deals with disparities across certain portions of Texas as it relates to school resource officers. And I think one of the key pieces on the report deals with the level of de-escalation and cultural competency training that our SROs, our campus police, our campus monitors, many of whom are retired from local police departments. So they do not necessarily have child psychology courses. They don't have what we want them to have as it relates to being culturally responsive training. So this gives policy recommendations because, and George Scott mentioned that I would mention this, if SROs, campus police, or campus monitors are coming in contact historically with Black and Brown students, there is already an innate fear. If we are in a pandemic now, but we will be coming back to school at some point in the near future. Those ACEs for Black and Brown children will be escalated. So their contact with SROs, campus monitors, and campus police will be heightened. So when we get back to whatever normalcy will look like, we need to take extended efforts to outline what SROs, campus monitors, and campus police roles and responsibilities are, work with them on culturally competent or culturally responsive practices, and have conversations with them that this particular webinar, and share resources with them that this particular webinar speaks to, because more often than most, their career training is in direct opposition to what schools are trying to do as it relates to culturally responsive practices. Thank you, David.
Absolutely. And at the same time that we are having those deep conversations with our SROs, we need to more generally be having those deep conversations with our local law enforcement. Every school district has a memorandum of agreement between education and law enforcement. It was updated and revised last year. You need to know your MOA, know what it says, but more importantly, right now, between now and September, in every community across the state, we should be having conversations with our local law enforcement about how we work with each other moving forward. We know that there are times where we are required under state or federal law, generally under state law, but there are times where we are required to contact law enforcement. There are times where law enforcement is required to respond. But how do they respond? How do they come into the school? And there is a huge degree of discretion in how that happens. We don't want that to happen in ways that are negative, that exacerbate fear, that raise tensions, that potentially cause the escalation of situations. So we need to have those discussions, not only superintendent to police chief, but in a larger way in our communities. It is required to happen every year. Sometimes districts and law enforcement would just sort of go through the motions and sign the agreement again. It's time this year for a deeper, meaningful discussion because we have to be ready come September to think in a fundamentally different way about how education and law enforcement work together. And we need a clear understanding of the parameters of each role. So even though we have a memorandum of agreement that is largely uniform, the way that is implemented varies incredibly from district to district in the state of New Jersey. And we need to make sure that we are proactive in establishing what those parameters should be. We also have to be aware that there have certainly been instances where horrific racist terms have been used in our school. In particular, we've struggled with the increasing use of the N-word in our schools and struggled with how we respond to that. So I think there is a pretty much universal agreement that the use of that word is not appropriate in the school environment. And if students were using that word, it would, I would suspect, in all of your districts be a violation of your code of student conduct. So that's a given, but context matters in determining exactly how we respond to that use. There can be an incredibly different impact depending on how students are using it, who they're using it with, how others are receiving that particular word. So we need to take the time to understand that context. The word has also been used by staff members, and it has caused tremendous harm to students where we have had staff members using that word. There was a recent case where a staff member muttered the word under his breath. Students heard it, and ultimately that staff member was terminated. Tenure charges were brought. Our courts sort of went back and forth on it, but thankfully, ultimately, there was a ruling that this person should be terminated, that we cannot have staff members using that language. On the other hand, we have to not lose our common sense when we're thinking about the use of that word. If a staff member hears the word, is talking with other staff members without any students nearby and discussing and sort of conveying what they heard as part of an adult discussion about how we respond to it, we don't want to overreact and all of a sudden be looking to terminate someone. So George, you shared with us a very interesting case study from Wisconsin where perhaps the school district was overreacting in how they responded to a staff member who was conveying the fact that the word had been used. Do you want to mention that Wisconsin case?
Correct. So it was the equivalent of a paraprofessional in Wisconsin, and he was repeating the word back that a student had said to him. It was taken out of context, and he was fired immediately because of zero tolerance policy around the use of that word with staff. So just be cautious around any zero tolerance policies, period. That contextual context makes a difference. And I think in this case, it made an incredible difference. He was eventually hired back from by the school district once they had explored that their policy needed a little bit more latitude as it related to context.
So I think that's a very important point. We have to take the time to understand context. I'll mention briefly one other case here from South Jersey. It was by the name of Zaplinski. And it was a case where you had a security guard working in a school who decided to comment on the fact that a Philadelphia police officer had been shot and killed, and commented on social media and used a racist term about the person who had done the shooting, and said, "I'm tired of these black thugs killing our cops." School district found out that comment had been made, and that individual was terminated. Tried to sue, tried to challenge the decision, saying that somehow this was a violation of her First Amendment rights, and the school district prevailed. Because there are some comments we make that completely undermine our ability to continue to work with kids, staff, and parents in that school district. And that was one of those comments that that person forfeited her right to continue working in the school district, having made that sort of a public comment. So Rebecca, do you want to talk a little bit about the issues of recruitment, hiring, and retention? Actually, first, George, we were going to have you, I believe, talk about an Ed Trust document on retention.
Yeah, so if you're not familiar with the Educational Trust and Dr. King's work there as the CEO, last year they put out a "If You Will Listen, We Will Stay" document. It's about 20 pages long, and it really deals with retention of staff of color. I'm going to let Rebecca talk a little bit more about recruitment, but one of our biggest pieces is that we're seeing research that says staff of color, especially in environments in which there are no other staff of color for support systems or no administrators of color for support system, are not being retained within that 0 to 5 range and are leaving, and they're not leaving to go to other school districts, they're leaving the profession altogether. So in this particular document, they bring up, I'll just bring up one particular incident in which staff members of color, specifically African-American staff members, whether they be male or female, always being called in to deal with African-American students that may have discipline concerns with administration or with other teachers. Very rarely are those African-American male and female teachers called in to serve on academic committees or other areas that would deal with their intellectual prowess, but they are looked upon sociologically from a counseling framework, from a support framework, just because of their ethnic minority status. And we know that all African-American males and females can't necessarily relate to all of the students that we will engage within. It's our job as leaders to build cultural competency and culturally responsive practices within the entirety of our staff, our certificated and non-certificated staff, so that everyone can feel like they have a connection with kids of color. So that's just one instance in the Ed Trust document that talks about how you can keep communities of color who are staff members and retain them if you're not calling upon them to do work with specifically just working with African-American students who are in trouble.
Great. So, and Rebecca, do you want to talk about CJ Pride as an example on how we can address recruitment issues?
Absolutely. CJ Pride is the Central Jersey program for the recruitment of diverse educators. We are now all over the state. It's an organization that the district joins, and we meet and we talk about everything that George just spoke about: recruitment, hiring, and most importantly, job fairs. And we want to make sure that when we recruit and hire and go through these processes that we all do as a school district, that we make everybody feel welcome. And so we have to make sure of who's on the committee, who represents your district at a job fair, who represents you and the district that you work in. I know that when we have job fairs at CJ Pride, we attract over 800 people, and there's over 40 districts. The great part about our job fairs are you get to interview with the decision maker. You don't have to worry about going through a paper screening and then a round of interviews. You go right in, and sitting at the table is a superintendent, the director of HR, your curriculum people, your teachers. Your board members are welcoming people to the line. I think it's important to show all candidates, and particularly minority candidates, that they are welcome, and that if they come to work in your district, they are there for the long run. You are there to help them, give them a job, support them afterwards. Make sure that there's not only just mentors, but people that will be willing to listen and help them address any of the needs of their students or any of their needs. And a good example we give always is, for instance, especially now, even in virtual hiring, when a person comes in to interview, if they're not at a job fair, it's extremely important that they feel welcome and they're not overwhelmed. We all know that interviewing can be very overwhelming. You walk into a room, there's 20 people around the table. There could be principals and teachers, and it can be very unsettling, and you don't always do your best. So what we say is make sure the room is welcoming, make sure that everybody is introduced and everybody knows who they're talking to. Little things like that can make a difference. Make sure that we don't intimidate people before they ever even get hired as they walk into the room or as they come in for the interview. So CJ Pride is online, and you can certainly look into it. The idea is to support each other and attract people to the school, to help the kids, to help the communities, and most importantly, that there are people that they're not just thrown into the mix, and that there are people that will be there to support them.
Great. And one of the nice parts about CJ Pride is that it's not just one district competing against everybody else. It's a group of districts working together to try to collectively increase the pool of candidates that are more diverse. And I think that's a wonderful message to send, that if we do work together at this, we can make a real difference and see the bar move as far as the number of minority candidates that we are hiring.
Absolutely.
So George, Guy, you want to perhaps give some comments about some practices that we should think about replicating?
Definitely, and I'll be brief as I see our time is winding down. So there are some statements that denounce the murder of George Floyd. I took an example from Essex County and from Camden County. If you're on the line and you are a superintendent or a board member or anyone else, you should think about making those statements, and then what kinds of resources are you going to put in place after those statements are being made, so that we can expand our racial justice footprint, not just with this time, but continuing to move forward within it, because it's what we need to do. The 2002 New Jersey Amistad curriculum for social studies in pre-K to 12 has been around for some time. But if we look very closely, and this is for our curriculum supervisors and our directors of curriculum, what levels of implementation are you seeing happen with that on the ground level within classrooms, and how are you monitoring around that? Alliances with municipalities and faith-based organizations and nonprofits and NGOs and the local police and civic organizations. What kinds of partnering and listening centers and stations have been set up for folks to talk a little bit more about what we've been experiencing internationally as it relates to racial injustice? Are just some examples of things that are replicatable. As we look at some things by role, One of the things that we need to be able to talk about if you're a teacher on the line is that, is your classroom apolitical? So you heard David talk about political thoughts, but there are curricula that are being supported by New Jersey that are universally principled. And if we are making sure that we're trying to address things like Black Lives Matter, which has a resource guide, teaching tolerance, all of those things are important. Within each one of these roles, we made sure that we put down, listen to understand, make sure that you validate, learn some new things, and then put it into action. So we are seeing a great deal of listening, and we're experiencing a lot of listening right now. We want to make sure that we're validating lived experience, especially by people of color, especially by African Americans. That can be the first gateway to being an appropriate accomplice or ally. Validate the struggle. People are in pain. Your colleagues are in pain. Your colleagues of color are in pain. Validate their struggle, learn, and then we can put some things to action. David, next slide, please. I think one of the pieces that we can take as we relate to some of the things that are happening, and this is to our central office and our board members that may be on the line, is what is it that we are centering as it relates to race and racism and racial injustice? Albemarle County, Virginia has an incredible anti-racism Board of Education policy that predates some of the things that we saw with the murder of George Floyd. Been in existence since 2017. They have a very strong racial literacy component. Many of us are looking at equity, diversity, and inclusion board policies. I would ask for us, as we look at those board policies, to make amendments and adjustments to center some of that work around anti-racism. If there's board policy around it, then there's administrative procedure that supports it, and then we can start to really gain a foothold as it relates to racial injustice. Next slide, please, David.
So Robin, why don't you talk about our framework for moving forward?
So in looking forward, here are some suggestions in regards to what we can do today, what we can start doing immediately to start addressing some of the concerns that we have. It's a lot of times when we're looking at those big principles that George and David just got through referring to, those big universal principles that we should all be subscribing to. You know, sometimes those bigger, broader issues are too nebulous. And sometimes there's people that relate to deductive thinking, where you go from the general to the specific. There's some people that work more inductively, where you're going from the specific, then moving on to the more general principles. But I find it really helpful to hone in on exactly what the problem is, what you perceive is happening or not happening in your district that is causing you concern. So, and those concerns might be your classroom teacher, and you notice that your Black and brown students are always out of the class. They're always being pulled out for some disciplinary conversation or suspension or expulsion or whatever. And you may notice that just within the students that you have, that this is something that you're constantly seeing. You may notice how there's fewer Black and brown students in your honors or AP classes. You may notice patterns in absenteeism. However you see things, whatever is concerned for you, start there. The next step would be to start researching the problem. Is this something that you are simply seeing, or is this something that has a larger pattern to it? Then that validates, if you find that there's recurrences and patterns, then that validates your concern. And then you research the problem. And then we start looking at what we're finding with these particular problems and the research. And then we start looking at ourselves. Is there any real way? Is there some substantive way in which I am contributing to what I identify as a problem? And with any good training with culturally responsive practices, it always has that component of self-reflection. Because we come into this world, we have a body, we have an ethnicity, we have a family or some kind of caring unit that nurtures us. We have something. And there's not a single one of us who comes through this acculturation process, this socialization process, without acquiring biases. And we do it because we're human. And so one of the problems we have when we talk about racial anything, cultural competence, racial justice, whatever, we have this tendency to have a binary type of thinking. You know, people say, I either am or am not racist. And we certainly don't like to be identified as being racist. It's not a matter of whether you are or are not. It is a matter of the degree to which we are working on not being racist. It's on a continuum and not just one or the other. And so what happens is that self-reflection piece always has to be there. The fact that I'm African American does not get me off the hook for having sensitivity or not understanding other culture groups. You have to do your homework with every group. Understanding also that there's diversity within every group. So you do your homework, you do your scrubbing, you do your internal reflection. You start looking at your objectives. Okay, if I raise this issue about recidivism, if I raise the issue about disciplinary discrepancies, you know, what is my desired outcome? What do I want to accomplish when I start raising my voice? And you think about all of the protests, all the thousands and thousands of people across the globe that are protesting right now. At some point, we have to say, okay, where is all of this going? What is it that we definitely want to see happen in order to make sure this doesn't happen again? And how will we know when we've reached those objectives? So we start looking at the next step is assessing where we are, because all reform, all transformative action happens within a context. And each one of your districts are different, and they all have different issues. Why do they have issues? I know that because people are involved and people have issues. You know, so what is your district's cultural capacity? And some of the questions that you can ask and search for answers for in regards to that. For example, how has your district responded to increasing diversity in its student population? How does it deal with the linguistic diversity of your ELs? How is it dealing with the economic diversity of with your poor children? How are you handling the rise of Latino students in your building? You know, there's some cases where people, you know, I'll get a phone call saying, Robin, can you come and do a training? You know, I have predominantly white teachers that are confused about how to handle Latino students or Black students. You know, they've never had to do this before. And I appreciate those kind of conversations because nothing really changes until we start shining the light of truth on something. So I don't really mind, you know, in fact, I welcome, you know, that opportunity because we need to have those candid conversations. Nothing changes until we pull this stuff out into the light. So you have to assess where you are and what your district's capacity. If you find out that your district has not really moved that far on cultural, on issues, on racial issues, then that's some groundwork that needs to be done. And you can't ignore that because talking about racial issues is highly charged and it really touches upon those deep-seated values that we have. And they are triggers. And that's why we don't usually like to talk about race, especially those in the majority, because there's the privilege of not having to deal with race. So understand your district, understanding your context. When you start looking at your objectives, you've done the research now, you've done some self-reflection, you've looked at your context and your culture, then you start articulating your objectives. Who can you talk to about these? And in doing so, you're moving on to the next step to start building your coalition because you will need people of like-mindedness for support and for also for them to use their influence to help make productive change. This is not a solo act if we're talking about moving things from the first order to the second order to really start making changes. And you will also need it in order for motivation and to stay engaged yourself because it's a task. This is a task. You know, 50 years ago, there were civil rights demonstrations, and here we are, back, same point again. During the Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed. We didn't fulfill the mission of that act until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 100 years later. So you need your coalition to throw their weight behind the task. You need the coalition as a group of support to make sure that you all are staying engaged and motivated and not discouraged when you get pushback, because you'll get it. Expect it. It's okay. It's part of the process. It is really part of the process. When you have your guiding coalition, you want to look at what kind of process are you going to go through to develop and implement change? What steps will you have to identify? And this is a good thing to do. It helps you in articulating and recruiting other people to the perspective that you're trying to arrive at, to reach the objectives that you're trying to arrive at. And it lays out step by step. Here's what we're going to do. Here's how it works. And along the way, you're stopping, you're evaluating, you're communicating, and you're also being very careful to celebrate every success. So there weren't as many students expelled this month as last month, or suspended this month or than last month. That's a success. You know, a teacher who was initially fighting against you is now saying, you know what, I do see some discrepancies that you were talking about. That's a success. You celebrate every success, and you keep that process going. What we're trying to do is monumental. And what we had in the George Floyd case is a catalytic event, an event that kicks off and creates a domino effect. This is big. And the worst thing that could possibly happen after this man gave his life is for us not to seize the moment, not to carpe diem and make those changes and have those courageous conversations that we always talk about when we're supervising other people, but to have those courageous conversations within our district so that we can move from first order to second order changes. And so here's some suggestions that we've put forward, some things that you can do immediately. It starts with identifying those problems. And what'll happen is, as each stakeholder starts identifying different problems, the big pattern starts appearing. That, wait a minute, our kids are discriminated in policy, our kids are discriminated in disciplinary practices, our kids are discriminated in how we assign special ed, our kids are discriminated in how we assign honors classes. We're discriminating the living daylights out of these kids. But at some point, our eyes have to be open to the degree to which we're doing this to students. And then we're expecting them to jump from the bottom levels of Maslow's hierarchy. So we provide lunches for students who have, you know, reduced lunch, free or reduced lunches. We provide lunches, we provide breakfasts, some schools provide dinners. And then we think that because we met some of those basic needs, that they're supposed to jump all the way through the middle levels of the hierarchy up to self-actualization. I gave you breakfast. Why aren't you scoring a 5 on the standardized tests? Well, what's blocking that progression upward like that? Let's look at all the patterns of discrimination that lie in the middle. So I know we're short on time. So here's some suggestions on how to move forward. David, I'm going to give it back to you.
Thank you so much, Robin. I think it's an incredible framework that you've laid out. And celebrating successes is a huge part of it, but also being prepared to continue the work. This is an ongoing cycle. So, Rob, we do want to have folks respond to one other survey, and I will note at this point that we are going to extend a little bit beyond the time that we had planned. So are you able to pull up that poll at this point?
Sure. Do you want all three or just one of them?
Let's just do the one on Code of Student Conduct.
No problem. It's going to come up right now.
So to what degree do you believe that your district's effectively addressing issues of racial equity and justice in terms of your policies and practices related to the Code of Student Conduct? And we give 4 options.
Dave, while they're taking the poll, can you just address if they can share this presentation with their colleagues? We've had quite a number of wonderful comments that people that want to share this with
Yes.
their. Thank you.
So that is our hope. We want you to take this information and share it. So you will receive the recording of today's presentation. We want you to share this with everyone. And feel free to share the PowerPoint and all of the resources. That's exactly what we're hoping folks will do. So Rob, you want to let us know what you're seeing as far as results?
Let me know when you want me to close the poll, and I can actually post the results on the screen.
Great, so let's do that now. Let's close it just because we're a little short. And for some reason, I'm not able to see it on my screen, but maybe you can let me know.
Oh, I apologize. Okay, it's somewhat was 50%, fairly well was 34%, not at all was 9%, and extremely well was 7%.
So I think what we're seeing from this particular example is that we are recognizing we have some work to do. And I suspect we would see similar results in the other areas as well. So what we have given you, and we won't walk in great detail through this, but are some thoughts about a blueprint for action to think systemically moving forward. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We actually need to look closely at some of the work that we have already done. So every district has a comprehensive equity plan. It's something that we are required to do. Many of us have looked at it as a compliance document that we have to get through every 3 years. But when you actually take the time to read that document, it covers every aspect of what we do. And if we embrace it as something that is a way for us to leverage change, it will help us to move forward on issues of racial injustice and equity. That plan is a legal requirement, but it's something that oftentimes has simply gathered dust on a shelf. So we encourage you to take the time to look at that document that you have just enacted this past year, and every aspect of your school district's operations are covered in that document. But what we need to do is make it a meaningful document, not simply to have a goal, a specific goal that we're looking to achieve without any real way that we're going to get there. And that's why we've given some tips on specific parts of this. So on recruitment and hiring, George, Guy, I know that I believe you gave us the resource about Rowan. You want to just talk about that for a moment?
Sure. So the Rowan Impact Program, increasing male practitioners and classroom teachers. I know that there are some of our men of color that are on the call. Thank you so much for being on the call. Has about 17 students in its pipeline in the spring of 2021. Some of these students will be looking to get into pre-K to 12 education. They are males of color, and Rowan is doing a great job in supporting them, providing a men of color network to be able to enhance them. They're predominantly, I would say, in South and Central Jersey, but they are prepared to go all over New Jersey. So we'll be sending out information to the New Jersey Department of Education in all 21 counties when they're ready for graduation next year. If we could go to the next slide. So I think we've talked a lot about the code of conduct, and some of you said, 50% of you said that things are happening somewhat with regards to racial inequities within the code of conduct. And we've given you some questions that you should begin to ask yourself about the consistency of the code. And this is the biggest one when I do training. When was the last revision of the code? If it was in the 90s and there was no student input or diverse stakeholder input, then you need to go back and you need to adjust that. That can be a summer plan for you. Does it allow for administrative discretion? Is it applied equitably? If George, Robin, and David were to come to the same thing within the code of conduct, would they be applying it equitably? And are they aware of their own implicit biases as they are applying the code of conduct? And are they adjusting for that, because those implicit biases may be in direct opposition to the demographics in which they're applying the code to? I think one of the pieces that we talk about here is school suspensions are really an adult decision by Walter Gilliam at Yale University, who deals with their childhood center there. These are not suspension, these decisions are not decisions that are made by children. And oftentimes when kids are coming off suspension, we hope or we think that that suspension is going to somehow adjust behavior. And research has shown us that it does not adjust behavior. So we've got to start rethinking, doing more than reforming our codes of conduct and our discipline policies, but we've got a moment in time in which we can revolutionize those. Next slide, please, David.
So we did want to also talk about how in every part of what we do, we need to show that we are actually committed to issues of racial equity. So progressive supervision is critical. So much of what we talked about today is equipping our staff, providing them with resources, supporting their professional learning and professional growth. And that is essential for us to move forward. But accountability is critical too. Once we have provided that support, once we have made expectations clear, once we have laid out meaningful measures and built those coalitions, we need to make sure that our staff is committed to equity and that we hold all of our staff accountable when we see evidence of failure to commit to universal principles of equity and racial justice. We also want to think about, are we using measures of equity as part of progressive supervision? So in many cases when I'm doing trainings across the state, I'll ask administrators, can you think of the teacher or teachers in your building who are constantly sending African American students to the principal's office? And many times the answer is yes. If we're aware of these patterns that are out there, what are we doing beyond professional learning? When are we starting to say that your practice needs to change? And we are going to engage in progressive supervision and hold you to that change. To the extent that we're willing to go upstream and address these issues earlier on, we're not going to have to go downstream and look at extreme measures like tenure charges for conduct unbecoming and the profound harm that could be done to students through extended exposure to a staff member who's not supportive of issues of equity and racial justice. So progressive supervision is a critical part of racial justice. And sometimes it's the most difficult part. We have to build that level of trust as school leaders. We have to have that respect among our colleagues, and we have to have the support necessary, the political support necessary, frankly, in order to make necessary and difficult decisions. But it's an essential part of what we're doing to show that our commitment is real. George, you want to talk a little bit about issues of school climate?
As it relates to school climate and equity, I think it's important for us, especially in this time and space in which we are dealing with racial inequities and racial justice within our schools, when we come back and we find ourselves back within the school environment, emotionally and physical safetyness and healthy learning environments are important. I think what we need to begin to look at as we are expanding, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in professional learning, our professional learning opportunities with mental health that you heard George Scott talk about need to be expanded to our guidance departments, our child study teams, our student assistance counselors, and our teachers, so that we are providing physically and safe learning environments. Do our teachers and all of those other stakeholders that I mentioned know about adverse childhood experiences? Do they know about trauma-informed instruction? Do they know about restorative practices as it relates to bringing students back in right relationships? All of these things deal with a more equitable climate that we can begin to think about, because we know that school is going to look very, very different in September. But so these are opportunities that we can use. Also, we need to be looking at school safety teams beyond the two times a year compliance piece that we have with our school safety teams. And I, for one, am one of those who needs to look clearly at that in my building. Why aren't we using that more on those individuals more as a resource? Because those are teachers in our building, those are community members that can be giving us information, especially about trauma. Are there people of color on those school safety team so that they can be giving us insights and be kind of links to the friendship bench that you heard George Scott talked about informally, so that we can get insights. Not that they are speaking for communities of color, but they can certainly give us better insights than some of our homogenous school safety teams that we have, and I'm talking about ethnic homogeneity. Next slide, please. So when we talk a little bit about professional learning, I adapted this mission statement from Learning Forward. And if you're not a New Jersey Learning Forward or a National Learning Forward member, we encourage you to do that because they always include equity in the work that they're doing. I think as we look at this professional learning that I mentioned in the last slide, is it addressing issues of racial inequity? That's where we need to couch it. Not just diversity, not just inclusion, those are buzzwords, but we know that the research is showing us that Black and brown children and demographics of Black and brown children are specifically underperforming. So what is it that we know? And there's a lot of research around sustained professional learning that can be built within the school day, not one and done opportunities, but sustained professional learning that begins to deal with racial inequity. So we've got to be able to build the capacity of those who are giving the professional learning, whether that is a turnkey by our staff or administrators or others that are giving that professional learning, the capacity to talk specifically and clearly about race. And we need to be able to leverage that and bring those into our curriculum and instruction conversations, our conversations about social emotional learning, our conversations that will deal with any aspect of professional learning really needs to deal with racial inequity. Next slide, please, David. So we have some resources here, and I'll allow my colleagues to jump in. I know that Robin has the first two resources, so I'll let her talk about those, and then I'll begin to talk about the rest.
So right now, two of the hottest selling books on understanding race and racial dynamics are authored by those first two people, Robin DiAngelo and Kendi are the two hottest ones. In between, I have Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. And he has some interesting perspectives on racial dynamics and some of the components that go into a variety of microaggressions. So these are folks that are very highly informed, very insightful, and have a wonderful way of communicating their insights. And so those are some folks that we strongly recommend.
Thank you, Robin. So also Tiffany Jewell, this book is not is anti-racist. She gives 20 lessons for folks to be able to work with. 40 books on anti-racism, because we are all looking for those summer reads, even though in a pandemic, our summer reads will look a little bit different than they have in the past. These are wonderful works from the Illinois Principals Association just for building leaders, principals, vice principals, and assistant principals. Cherry Hill Public Schools, my own district, has come out with some incredible resources for families, students, and educators. They're not the only school district that has done that. Many have. George Moore, with 21 Days of Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge, gives you some insights into things in which you can begin to look at your racial makeup and start over a 21-day period to begin to make this a part of habits. Malcolm Gladwell says, if we do things for 13 times or more, then it will become habit for us. So 21 opportunities can begin to build up our racial habits beyond where we are today. Next slide, please. Thank you, David. So we talked about recruitment and retention, myself and Rebecca. So we're not doing enough for teachers of color. This is John King's. He gives an op-ed in the Washington Post, and he talks about the tax that teachers of color will have to take. I talked a little bit about those taxes, but we need to begin to know that teachers of color are coming into our spaces and they have additional burdens outside of teaching and learning. And they have additional trauma that some of our staff members haven't had. So we need to be able to make sure that we're supporting them in very rich ways by educating ourselves. The microaggressions in classrooms give you some ideas about general microaggressions. If you're not sure of the term, that's Daryl Wing Sue from Teachers College, who has popularized the term, but others have come up with the term before Dr. Sue. Creating Opportunities Through Learning at the University of North Carolina is a great online module that centers, frankly, race into some of our relationality. And it is designed for teachers, but administrators can go through this. The next two, Adaptive Leadership by Ron Heifetz at Harvard Graduate School of Education and the Government School at JFK at Harvard, and the Improvement Guide deal more specifically with Dr. Daniels and what she's talked about with improvement measures and being able to understand all the things that come into play when you're trying to move from, as she said, first order improvement to second order improvement. So those are supplements that will help you. Next slide, please. So in terms of how we imagine equity and access for youth, this is another University of North Carolina support that we find very, very important. The next one deals with classroom removals and goes with code of conduct and making sure that we're having our staff and our SROs. I would encourage you, if you have SROs, campus monitors, or campus police, to adjust these alternatives and give them some in-service around classroom removal, because oftentimes they are called upon, they should not be called upon, but they're called upon to be a part of that. So this would help them. We've got some climate surveys from the NJDOE, which are for student, staff, and families, which are very, very important and can be used as a resource for you. Baruti Kafeli, our own Baruti Kafeli out of East Orange and Newark, tells us a little bit more in the ASD profile on mood and lifestyle that deal with climate and culture. Our own Howard Stevenson at the University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education deals with racial literacy. Specifically, he is one of the persons that has first coined the term, but this talks about racial literacy in professional development. And then we talked a little bit about school resource officers, and David gave us a great article about school resource officers that just came out in the New York Times today. So that's another incredible resource for you. Next slide, please.
So at this moment, let me just pause. I know we did go a little bit long, but this is such an incredibly important conversation. I do want to pause for questions, Rebecca, that we may have from participants.
One of the most prominent questions was, are we working on a follow-up to this? What's after this particular wonderful, wonderful workshop this morning? Tremendous amount of thank yous from people. The next steps from here.
So there will absolutely be many follow-up steps. We have a number of trainings that we are planning for this summer. And I know George, Guy, and Robin, I don't know if you want to mention any of the trainings that you're going to be part of that are upcoming.
Sure.
That's all available on our website, by the way. I meant to include that link.
I have a few coming up. I have Culturally Responsive Practices Part 1 on July 7th, Part 2 on July 10th, and then Part 3 on July 16th. So I have those three coming up in the next few weeks.
Great.
Be happy to see you.
And George, I'm guessing we too.
Yeah, I have one coming up right now, but I'm quite sure we'll be talking about more, especially after this webinar. Right now on July the 9th, I will be talking about family engagement, which we will put the racial justice work as it relates to families, and specifically families of color, that we'll be zoning in on July the 9th.
So we wanted to just remind folks of some of the other resources that are available to you as well. Free webinars that we have done previously, and we give you links to those to help you as we were struggling with and still are, with our global pandemic. And we are planning a session July 8th and 9th to help school districts think through reopening. And part of that will be thinking through reopening in light of the issues of racial justice that we're also struggling with now. Another question or two, Rebecca, before we wrap up?
No, but I want to read something from one of our colleagues that really sums up what the majority of people have been writing. I just want to express my gratitude for this webinar and these resources. I deeply appreciate all the effort that went into putting this panel and training together. This has been so deeply impactful to me as a professional. Thank you. And we have a variety of those over and over, and the gratitude for addressing the topics and bringing together such an amazing panel. So thank you all on behalf of all of these wonderful comments from all our colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone. For our panelists, before I make just a quick final remark or two, any final thoughts?
You know, David, if I can, I want to piggyback on something that Robin shared earlier. You know, yes, the George Floyd death exposed, and what it exposed in my lexicon is the wound. Now, there is something natural that can happen because it's happened for 400 years. We could let it scab over and it will never heal. I have a phrase that I use with my families here: only clean wounds heal. Emotional or physical, we have to do the work to make this heal, and we will all be better for it.
Great comment. Robin, any final thoughts?
No, I appreciate this opportunity and look forward to the many conversations that are going to come out of this. This is such a pivotal time in our nation with everything that is going on. And certainly events like this have happened before, but never with this kind of global response. And I'm hopeful, but we have to keep pressing. We have to seize the moment. We have to make our case for why it is finally time for changes to come. And so I'm looking forward to the opportunities that lie ahead to discuss, debate, work together, collaborate, all of those awesome verbs to make second order changes. So thank you.
Absolutely. And George Guy?
Thank you, David. I just want to thank our awesome panelists and the work that we've done and just opening up the door for this. I would say that the 4 things that we mentioned in terms of our roles within the webinar: we need to listen, we need to validate, we need to put ourselves in a position to learn, and then we need to act. And if we do all 4 and we consistently do that over the course of every moment of our days, then we'll be moving this country and our pre-K to 12 schools here in New Jersey in a more racially just environment. Thank you.
Thank you. And as one final comment, I do want to say that I do think this is a time for hope, but it's also a time for challenge. And we have to be willing to overcome our own discomfort. We have to show the courage to have these difficult conversations. We have to show the persistence that we won't be tired, that we'll continue to fight, that we'll continue to move forward. And I know that all of you who have taken the time to be part of this, you are committed. And I want to thank you for all of the incredible work you are doing to support our children and to support each other. And everything that we can do to help you moving forward, we will be here as your partner. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to continuing this work and supporting you in every way we can moving forward.